In the name of the one who loves us, the one who saves us, and the one who spurs us ever on. Amen. Please be seated. For those of you that don't recognize me, I am your rector. I have not been here for 5 weeks. It is certainly good to be back with you this morning. You know, waiting is difficult. Whether it's for surgery, for election results, or the return of Jesus, for that matter. Waiting requires of us to let go of control. And we're in a place where things are unknown. And the readings that we heard this morning, those people that first heard them, they were waiting for the imminent return of Jesus. So Paul, in his letter to the Thessalonians, says you're going to have to wait for a while, so you need to work. Get at it. Get at the work of the gospel. For those that heard Luke's gospel for the first time, this was written about 55 years after Jesus died, and the temple was already destroyed. It was hard. But almost every generation in history at one time or another has thought it was time for the world to end, that Jesus coming back was imminent, and they would look for signs all around them. When I was younger, I was intrigued by apocalyptic prophecies and the so-called signs. This past week, there was one such sign: a lunar eclipse and the appearance of a blood moon. There's a whole channel on the prophecy site that just talks about blood moons. And they're orange, and they are certainly not a sign of anything other than a lunar eclipse. But some folks do believe that they point to the end of days. There are entire industries devoted to end times, to Armageddon, to the rapture. As I said, from the prophecy channel to companies that are going to provide you all the food you need when the end of the world comes, at least for a year. There are conferences, and also there are books. This is a very old series, but it's called the Left Behind series. We have a fascination with end times, and is it any wonder, as we reflect on our experiences of pandemics and war, natural disasters and political chaos around the globe, that we wouldn't think back to these readings that we hear at the end of each church year that speak to when Jesus will come again and prepares us for Advent. Which one of us can forget the images of what's left at Fort Myers Beach in the aftermath of Hurricane Ian, or the devastation of cities in Ukraine that have been leveled by Soviet bombs? So it's no wonder that Jesus' words this morning might make all of us just a little bit uncomfortable. And that is where Jesus' disciples find themselves as they listen to him talk about the destruction of the temple. When is this going to happen, they ask. What will be the sign? They, like us, were trying to make sense of what Jesus was saying in light of all the changes in their world. How they are to live and to respond in the meantime while they wait. And while there's no reason to believe that any of the events that they or we are witnessing are in fact apocalyptic, Jesus' instructions to his disciples and to us in this morning's gospel do have something to say when viewed in light of what it means to follow a crucified Jesus in the meantime. For the Jewish people, the temple was the center of the religious and political universe for them. It wasn't only a physical structure, but it was also an icon representing the stability of God's relationship with God's chosen people. And its destruction, a little bit before when this gospel was written, after the death of Jesus by Roman authorities, that associated disruption compounded by the experience of persecution and violence of both Christians and the Jewish people, pointed to an uncertain future. It was interpreted by some as the end times. Jesus must be coming soon. Wasn't that what Jesus described? Then when you add to that the family crisis that was taking place as Christianity and Judaism split. So the young church was also being crucified or being persecuted by the people that were part of the temple governance as well as the Romans. Luke's version of this story, like Mark and like Matthew, where it also appears, is a little bit different because it adds arrests and prisons and persecutions, anticipating the stories that we will hear in the book of Acts that we normally hear after Easter. So in Luke's gospel, Jesus' apocalyptic warnings, they don't stop with just wars and insurrections. He adds a critical condition. You will be persecuted. You will be arrested and imprisoned. But this is your chance to be a witness, to offer testimony with the example of your lives. And Luke uses the same word, paramidomai, that's later used when Jesus is arrested, indicating that Christians can expect the same for themselves. You know, we live in a culture where we've Americanized Jesus just a little bit. We think that as Christians, we're going to have lives of peace and stability, and that we're not going to have to suffer. But that's not the way of the crucified Jesus. So Luke offers these words of comfort when Jesus says, "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Not a hair of your head will perish, because by your endurance, you will gain your souls." So after wading through all the speculation about the destruction of the temple and wars and famines and persecution and going to prisons, I have come to the realization that maybe this text is not so much about predicting the second coming of Christ or the end times, but instead how we are to wait and act as followers of Jesus in the face of suffering. What kind of witness do we give when faced with death, when faced with betrayal and even disruption? Womanist theologian M. Shaw Copeland writes, "Suffering, pain, separation, incompleteness, and disorientation. It can render us powerless and mute." And while this can be true, friends, I have also seen great suffering change people and provide an opportunity for those who have been changed to tell of their hope. In his book, Disciplines of the Spirit, theologian Howard Thurman describes this kind of change. And I imagine each one of you here could probably name someone who this describes. Into their faces comes a subtle radiance, a settled serenity. And into their relationships, a vital generosity that opens the sealed doors of the heart in all who are encountered along the way. And I have seen this here among you. Those of you that have lost children, did not let bitterness grab a hold of your heart. Those of you that have suffered with illness, still managed to find joy. And I witnessed this as I journeyed with a cousin who suffered from a terminal neuromuscular disease over a period of 5 years. And she was the most joy-filled and faithful person I have ever encountered in facing what she knew would be a terrible death. And while suffering for suffering's sake is never God's intent for any of us, Jesus reminds us that when we follow the crucified one, suffering is inevitable, but that we can redeem it because we are a people not left without hope when we are pushed to its borders. For faithful followers of Jesus, there is no escape from the world of suffering. How do we live this out? This Christian walk and witness. How do we testify to the love of God, which is the good news, in a massively afflicted world? Well, we don't do it alone. I think that's where we sometimes get in trouble, when we think we have to face suffering alone. Because we're reminded by the entire narrative that Luke gives us, both through his gospel and through the book of Acts, that the primary activity of the Spirit of God and the presence of Jesus is to sustain and empower the church, the community, you and I together, for its shared witness. Don't do it alone. Instead, we are called to encourage one another in the face of fear, in the face of suffering, to speak out, to act, and to use those opportunities to be reminders of the hope that Jesus offers. And I see this most poignantly in our Walking the Mourner's Path ministry. Called to stick together, to be community for one another, especially when difficulties surround us. Our gospel tells us we can truly rely on God and have faith through our trials, tribulations, and life changes, that God is present with us and not a hair on our head will be destroyed, that we will always be with God. You know, our mission statement here at St. John's says that we are called to deepen our relationship with God and one another through Christ. Both times of joy, but also, I think most importantly, in times of suffering. There are many ways that we can do this. Might I suggest it starts with how we relate to one another. What if we were intentional here at St. John's about forgiving one another, being truly transparent and vulnerable so that we can walk alongside one another? What would change if we made a point of being genuinely present to one another at home and in whatever context we find ourselves, detached from our phones, detached from those TikTok videos that keep me up at night, detached from texts and social media feeds? Imagine how our relationships would deepen and be transformed as we made time for one another and for God. We truly appreciate each other. Be there for one another in our suffering, as opposed to merely knowing who that person is who sits with their daughter on the left side of the church, or who that woman is that sings in the choir, or who they are that's always texting in church, or that couple with the noisy and squirmy kids. Called to something deeper than that. And I believe we have all the tools necessary to nurture a depth of friendship, relationship, and understanding that we don't often find in our world, that could help us be mindful of the different needs of others as we discern where God is calling this community in the meantime, which is where we're at. Now, shortly, we're going to renew our baptismal promises, and that is a roadmap of how we are to witness, how we are to give testimony. Imagine what it would be like if we knew each other so well that we could risk not only sharing our joys, our pain, that we could really be truthful with one another, that would be willing to receive as well as give care. The lesson I'm learning the hard way. I don't know about you, but I don't like to ask for help. That's also part of our witness. Friends, Jesus reminds us he will give us words and wisdom that none of our opponents will be able to withstand or contradict, and he will empower us to work and grow together as change agents in our church and in our community. You know, I've shared this story before, but there was a church in California that decided that they were going to be a witness in a very tangible way in their neighborhoods. And so one Sunday every quarter, instead of meeting for traditional Sunday morning worship, the entire community gathered on the front lawn, and everybody was given jobs to do local mission work. And then they met later in the day to talk about their experience, celebrate Eucharist, and share a meal. And the result of their efforts, that this particular church is a vital and enlivened congregation that knows and serves its neighborhood. And it wasn't like that before. Can you imagine the transformative nature of mission and the sense of hope others would gather when they saw that? When they see us through our words, our deeds, our spirit, as we work together in so many ways that we do here at St. John's, providing a sense of hope, what at first glance might look like a hopeless situation. Tonight, we're sponsoring an interfaith prayer service. United We Pray. We're working with other faith congregations in Howard County to do just that, to support refugees that have come to Howard County who are escaping persecution and suffering. And even in the midst of destruction, faith would be speaking a powerful word of love and of hope. Friends, our gospel this morning, this entire passage is calling us to do just that, to be a witness in and to a broken world. May it be so.